Welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a super fascinating historical journey into the unexpected origins of the traditional church wedding. You know the classic scene, right? The grand architecture, the stained glass windows, walking down the aisle to that swelling organ music. It kind of feels like it's been that way since literally day one of Christianity, like this ancient unbroken rule. But when I started diving into the historical and theological sources, I actually found a deeply surprising story. We're going to unpack exactly how this whole tradition was built up, layer by layer over centuries.
And that brings us to a pretty provocative question, one that might actually challenge some assumptions you hold. Must a Christian get married in a church? It's what most of us expect today, and yeah, it's a beautiful tradition. But here's the surprising truth we uncover when we look at the historical data. The idea of a mandatory church wedding? It doesn't actually come from the New Testament, at all. It is, in fact, an ecclesiastical tradition that evolved really gradually over hundreds of years. Honestly, the early Christians would probably be totally shocked by our modern wedding expectations.
Okay, so let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with 1, the origin of the tradition. Then 2, from homes to the altar. After that, 3, the rules of marriage. 4, secular versus religious marriage. And finally, 5, the core of the covenant. Let's get right into it.
Starting right at the beginning of our timeline with Section 1, the origin of the tradition and the first-century reality.
So, looking at the historical context of the first century, early Christian marriages didn't look anything like they do today. Why? Well, simply put, there were literally no buildings dedicated to Christian worship yet. Early congregations just met in people's homes. Because of that, marriage was fundamentally a familial and civil act. Early Christians basically just followed the everyday civic customs of the Roman Empire or their local Jewish community. The faith community definitely recognized the union and offered a blessing, for sure, but it absolutely did not require some specialized formal ceremony inside a temple. It was just a normal, everyday reality rooted right there in the home and the community.
So, how in the world did we get from those intimate home gatherings to massive, grand cathedrals? Let's trace this in Section 2, from homes to the altar, a 1,500-year journey.
Now, what's really fascinating about this timeline is just how incredibly slow and gradual this shift was. In the first century, like we said, purely a civil and familial custom. Moving into the 2nd through 4th centuries, believers started seeking the blessing of a bishop or presbyter, but mostly, this was still happening outside of a formal church building. The really big shift kicks off in the 4th century. Once Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and those grand basilicas were built, clergy involvement became way more public. But get this, even then, it wasn't mandatory. Making it a strict rule didn't actually happen until way later in the Middle Ages.
Before it became strict law, the physical location of the ceremony actually migrated step by step. During most of the Middle Ages, the exchange of vows and consent still happened right in the home. But then, around the 9th century, something super interesting happened. The ceremony moved to the church doors. And this wasn't just for, aesthetic reasons. It was highly intentional. The sources indicate this was designed specifically to guarantee the wife's freedom and ensure mutual consent in a highly visible public space. Finally, by the end of the 16th century, the whole shebang had moved all the way inside, landing right at the altar where we're used to seeing it today.
But why did this physical shift even happen in the first place? Well, beyond the theology, a major driver was literally just practical. As the Roman concept of marriage, viewing it as a legally binding contract for inheritance and legitimacy, really gained ground, people desperately needed these agreements officially recorded. In a lot of medieval communities, it just made practical sense to go to the one guy in town who could actually read and write to make sure your contract was legit. The local priest was often the only literate person around, so the community naturally relied on the church to accurately document their legal contracts. Eventually, though, that practical necessity evolved into formal, codified law. Let's look at Section 3, the rules of marriage, codifying the tradition.
2 major councils essentially locked the church wedding into place as law. First, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 took a massive step by requiring public bans, which are basically public announcements before a wedding, just to prevent secret or clandestine marriages. Then later, the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563 issued the famous Thomatsy Decree. For the Catholic Church, this officially mandated that a valid marriage required a parish priest or an authorized priest and at least 2 witnesses. Notice that massive jump on our timeline. It literally took until the 1500s for this single decree to firmly consolidate the church wedding as a strict requirement, shaping the tradition exactly as we know it today.
However, during the 16th century Protestant Reformation, the Reformers had a noticeably different take on this. Martin Luther maintained that marriage was absolutely a divine institution created by God, but he also firmly saw it as an issue of civil order. Because of that, he didn't believe it required a temple ceremony at all. On the flip side, John Calvin actively promoted the ecclesiastical blessing of marriage, but he explicitly recognized the government's authority over the legal aspects of it. Now, over time, Protestant churches did adopt the practice of church weddings, but they did it for pastoral, liturgical, and community reasons, not because they believed the New Testament strictly mandated it.
This historical split brings us directly to a big point of modern confusion. Let's untangle those definitions in Section 4, secular versus religious marriage.
First up, let's get a clear definition of secular marriage. In general terms, it's simply a legal union between two people recognized by the state through civil law, without requiring any kind of religious ceremony, and it's really important to remove any negative stigma here. Historically speaking, the term secular just meant it wasn't a specifically Christian rite. It doesn't inherently mean it's anti-God or empty of meaning, you know? It just means its validity rests on civil legislation rather than religious authority.
So the crucial point is how different traditions actually view this secular reality today. Impartially speaking, from a Catholic perspective, marriage between baptized individuals is considered a sacrament. This normally requires canonical form, meaning an authorized priest or deacon has to officiate. But from a Protestant, evangelical, and Wesleyan perspective, marriage is seen as an institution created by God, legally regulated by the state for societal order, and spiritually blessed by the Church. In this view, the Church lovingly walks alongside the couple, but it isn't the entity that actually creates the marriage itself.
And this brilliantly illustrates the objective breakdown. For a civil or secular marriage, it's recognized by the state, it produces legal effects, uses a civil official, and its validity comes straight from civil law. A religious marriage, in contrast, is recognized by the faith community, it emphasizes spiritual commitment, uses an authorized minister, and its deeper meaning is defined by the specific doctrine of that tradition. They serve parallel but distinctly different functions.
Which leads to a highly practical and very often asked question: can a secular marriage be Christian? Well, the answer from many theological perspectives is a resounding yes. Think about missionaries living in countries where only civil marriage exists, or maybe a Christian couple who marries before a civil judge just because a pastor isn't available. As long as there is a biblical commitment between a man and a woman, a true intention of permanence, and mutual fidelity, that civil union can absolutely be a valid Christian marriage before God. It's all about the heart of the covenant, not the paperwork.
So if the building isn't the defining factor, what is? Let's move to our final section, Section 5. The core of the covenant, the biblical core.
When we go back and look at the actual biblical sources, the emphasis is entirely on the covenant itself, not the GPS coordinates of where it happens. Genesis 2:24 tells us marriage is instituted by God. Hebrews 13:4 reminds us that the marriage bed must be kept honorable. Malachi 2:14 describes marriage fundamentally as a covenant made before God. Noticeably absent from this list, a physical building. The sources clearly show that the location of the ceremony is simply not presented as a biblical requirement. Ultimately, a religious ceremony adds beautiful worship, communal support, and dedicated prayer. And let's be real, those are truly wonderful, enriching things. But as our source material summarizes perfectly, the essential element is not the building, but the marriage covenant before God. The physical walls of a church don't magically confer spiritual validity. Your mutual fidelity, integrity, and commitment do. A secular reality becomes sacred when it's lived out in faith. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. In our modern celebrations, are we putting more emphasis on the grand location where we make our vows, or on the quiet, daily integrity with which we keep them?